Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's certainly the privilege for me to be here this evening to set the ball rolling for the Kalpana Chawla 4th ORF Annual Space Talks. It's definitely a privilege for me, and I'd like to thank Mr. Joshi and Raji for having given me this opportunity of being with you all in this wonderful gathering. My intention is to flag a few issues which I hope would be discussed in the next 2 days, and we come up with some tangible recommendations which could then be given to the government or the Office of the Principal Scientific Advisor, which I represent, and which could be passed on to ISRO for implementation if possible. I'd like to touch upon the following 4 things. One is, of course, a word about ISRO, the way we've started and the way we've grown at such a rapid pace. Then about the militarization of space, because that is something which is of concern to us. Like Mr. Joshi brought out, space is something which belongs to entire mankind. But unfortunately, the militarization has already started, and that is something we cannot wish away. I'd then like to touch upon the role of the private sector in our space ventures, that's our Indian. And finally, a word about the laws of space, which also need to be addressed, because at the moment things are not very clear. But before that, at the cost of a little repetition, a word about the person who we honor and remember this evening, that is Kalpana Chawla. A pride not just of India, but a pride of the entire world and humankind. Like Mr. Joshi said, born in Karnal, studied in Chandigarh, did her aerospace engineering before moving to United States for higher education. She joined NASA in 1988. And in 97, she went in for her first launch on the Columbia. A few years later, in 2003, 16 January, she went on the second voyage, which was the ill-fated one, and she perished along with 6 other crew members on re-entering Earth. A short life, but like we say, it's not how long you live, but what you do and what you leave behind. It certainly was a king-sized life, and she's left a lot for us. It's not just India or United States, but entire world will remember her and cherish her memory. It's actually a number of coincidences, what Mr. Joshi was also mentioning, but when I was reading up, surprisingly, the Indian space program started the year Kalpana Chawla was born, that is 1963. A little about the Indian space program. Like I said, 1963, early in 1963, a group of young scientists, among which was then young Dr. Abdul Kalam, fresh from United States, that studied there. They went to a small village outside Trivandrum, Thumba, basically because the Earth's magnetic equator passed through that, and that is a place they selected to set up the launch station. It was in a Mary Magdalene church, the bishop's house, and the cattle shed is where the first Indian Earth station was set up. Well, a rags to riches story, possibly that's not the correct word, a rags to riches story, but definitely it was a bullock cart cycle to a mission beyond Mars story. Because the first rocket that was launched, a Nike Apache rocket taken from NASA, in a dismantled condition, it was shifted to the launch site on bicycles and bullock carts. The bishop's house, the church, and the cattle shed were the laboratories, office, and the workplace for the first launch. And that is how India launched the first rocket in 1963, 21st November. We've come a very long way since then. It's been about 55 years, but immediately thereafter, a few years later, came Aryabhat, which was the first communication satellite built by ourselves. Then came Rohini, the first imaging satellite, and thereafter, as year passed, We built our first station in 29 September 1997 is when we did the first launch, our own satellite on our own rocket. And now we can boast of a Chandrayaan, a Mangalyaan, which was, I think, 10% the cost of NASA launching its rockets. Not a fair comparison because NASA's was heavier and the payloads was much more. But then 10% is a very, very small figure. And now we're in the process of launching Chandrayaan 2. Along with this, the spin-offs have also been much more than just our missions to the moon. The technology that ISRO built up was then used by DRDO, and this is as per open sources, which helped India in the nuclear weaponized program. Incidentally, the satellite launch vehicle, the first two stages of launch are the same what DRDO uses in the Agni series of missiles, the ballistic missiles, which are nuclear missiles. So it's been a spin-off. The technology was used, and we are using it even now. Crossing from the ballistic missiles, we come to touch upon the militarization of space. Ladies and gentlemen, space today is not just about satellites for video viewing, for your mobile telephones, or for communications. Whether we like it or not, a lot of militarization has taken place. There are a lot of satellites up there which are being used for defense purposes. As of now, there are two major things that space is being used for as far as military is concerned. One is for the passage of ballistic missiles through space, both for offensive missiles which are launched. They go through space, re-enter and come down, as also for defensive missiles as part of ballistic missile defense. Even some of those missiles meant to knock off an oncoming satellite are being used in space. The second thing that space is being used for militarily is for C4ISR functions. C4ISR would be command, control, communication, computerizations. I standing for intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. Now, these functions can be used both for civilian purposes as well as for military purposes. But the communications that are there are something which are used, and the satellites could be the same, the satellites could be different, because a satellite could technically be a civilian satellite, but it could also be performing a certain amount of bandwidth could be given for military use also. We saw about a year back that China had used a missile to knock off one of its own satellites, demonstrating the capability of knocking off a satellite in space. The ethics of space were that no weapons of mass destruction were meant to be placed in space or on any of the celestial bodies on top. So fortunately, that has not been done till now, but it's not clear as to what kind of weapons, kinetic, lasers, etc., can be placed on space. So this is something we'll touch upon later. The United States has been doing a lot of work on militarization in space. And as per one of the studies conducted, they felt that the satellites which are there today for C4ISR functions are useful only for battle or war at the higher level, and not for people in the tactical battle area, for the actual troops, because the inputs that are coming to them are of a higher, the data that is coming in, etc. Except for a certain amount of low-level communications, these satellites are not really useful for troops on ground. So what they now say is that they've divided the air above us into three zones. One is the international airspace, which goes up to about 65,000 feet or roughly 20 kilometers. From 20 kilometers to 100 kilometers is what we now term as near space. And beyond 100 kilometers and above is what you call outer space. Very broadly, your communication satellites are at the higher level at about 36,000 feet, 36,000 kilometers and beyond. Your imaging satellites, because they've got to be lower, are at about 600 odd kilometers, so that you get clearer images and but the lower space that is there is not being exploited today. What the Americans feel is that for military level, lower space should be exploited, and this exploitation should be useful for troops on ground. That means it'll be much cheaper. You will have more different kind of weapons. It's not just satellites, but you can have drones of various kinds, whether you even push up balloons, etc., etc. A lot of stuff can be done at this lower altitude at a much cheaper price. So that is what people are working on, and let's see how it goes. And the assets at all three levels, that is international airspace, up to 20 kilometers, 20 to 100 and beyond, will all be synergized, and they would all contribute as force multipliers in the battlefield at all levels. Now, when you've got so much of equipment that is moving on top, you need a structure for the command and control to synergize the entire thing. What the Indian services have suggested is what we are calling the Space Command. It is a command, a new tri-service command, which has been recommended, and as per news reports, the government is looking at it very favorably, and we are hopeful that this would come through in the near future. Because this is something that we need, like we said, a growing number of assets in space, the growing number of military people, and the point is to synergize and use it in a safe manner. Somebody has to be there to control it. And I would recommend that during our deliberations over the next 2 days, we could discuss this and other means. What we got to take on is that our interests and assets in space have to be looked after. We've got to find ways and means of doing it. Gentlemen, next, as Dr. Joshi mentioned, there has been rapid expansion of assets in space. With the growing number of satellites, launch stations, launch vehicles, at least in India, ISRO is not in a position to handle it beyond a particular level, firstly because of finances, secondly because of manpower, and thirdly infrastructure that is available. And also we feel that these peripherals now, which technology is already developed, must be passed on to the private sector, where ISRO can concentrate only on core research items. So there's no point in them doing the same thing they started in 1963, it's 2018. We've come a very long way. We are very confident of what we can achieve. We must achieve for higher and higher levels of technical competence. The mundane stuff of building satellites, launch vehicles, etc., must be passed down to the private sector. Privatization in NASA, SpaceX, with the Tesla hurtling towards the asteroids has been discussed amply. But the fact is today we need to privatize in India. A certain amount of efforts and steps have already been taken. You find Antariksh is a commercial arm of ISRO. And the job is to promote ISRO's products, services, and technology. The turnover in 2014 and 15 Antariksh was about 18 billion rupees. Now, it's purely a government body and a public sector undertaking, but some efforts are being made to do that. Also, last year, the ISRO chief in the satellite department was on television, and who said that there is a dire need for us to privatize. 80% of the launch vehicle parts are being privatized. And I'm told a number of systems of Chandrayaan-2, which is to be launched in the next 1 or 2 months, have also been privatized, and a lot of private trust there. Also, the new Space Activities Bill. In our country, it's a draft bill which has been put on the ISRO website. The basic thing is to see how private sector can step into space products. This bill is there, they're looking for comments, etc., and I do hope that this bill too could be discussed in the deliberations, and we can pass it down as to see whether changes are required, what could be done, so that this is what is going to help us to bring about more privatization in the space field. Now, with the amount of traffic that has gone up in space, we've got to have some road rules to see how to manage space. I'm using this word specifically because you find Airbus is in the process of making 500 or more mini satellites for launch. You have private companies which have been cleared in space travel for private was cleared in 2004. So the fact is, the more you've got assets in space, you've got to have proper rules and regulations to govern them. The committee which is responsible to the people who are responsible for making the rules is the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, which is called the COPUS. The Outer Space Treaty of 1967 forms the basis of all international laws for space. Now, this is associated with 5 international treaties and a set of principles. And over the years, a number of other treaties have also been discussed, but most of them in draft because nothing more has been formalized. Something came up in 2008, something covered in 2013, but a lot of things have to be discussed. What we need is specific measures. Today, the treaties are nebulous. Verification is being done. United States does its own verification. Russia does its own verifications. So what is actually happening in space is not really known. The need for the hour is to have proper rules at the national level for us and for international treaties at the international level. Because space is a heritage of mankind. And all treaties are there, they basically stress on the fact that space must be used for the benefit of mankind and not for benefit of any particular country. Also, at all costs, we could use space for C4I and other functions, but moving actual weapons into space should never be permitted. Like I said, WMD is not permitted, but even to permit kinetic weapons or lasers and all is something that we've got to put our foot down and never let that happen. Ladies and gentlemen, that is all that I had to say. Finally, I'd like to say that India is a major space power today. We are among the 4 or 5 nations in the world which have a fairly large footprint in space. It is for us to take active steps, if not the lead, in international forums, during disarmament talks, etc., to set the pace for making practical treaties in space so that complete mankind benefits. And at the end of it, what we're looking for is tangible treaties which can be implemented. I'd like to wish the deliberations over the next 2 days success. Like I said in the beginning, one can only hope that with the gathering of such fantastic professionals and of all fields who are here, we come up with some tangible recommendations which can be implemented. Thank you very much.